critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, it's just gone 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia and around the world. It's time for The Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here on The Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat here in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth and to inform, educate and entertain, all with dignity and respect. Well, today, 9/11, it's the 23rd anniversary of the attack on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. And most people know where they were when reports came in of planes crashing into the World Trade Center. I was filming with Professor Stephen Hawking in Cambridge at that time. And it's one of the most traumatic events of the century, not just for Americans, but for the whole world. The official version from the US government states that 19 terrorists from Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial aircraft and crashed 2 of them into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center complex in New York City. The first plane hit at the North Tower at 08:46 Eastern Time, and the second crashed into the South Tower at 09:03. At 9:37, the third plane destroyed the western face of the Pentagon, the giant headquarters of the US military just outside the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. A fourth plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 after passengers fought back. It was suggested that the hijackers had meant to attack the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Basically, horrendous, terrible damage, but also the official death toll was, after numerous revisions, was set at 2,977 people, not including the 19 terrorists. Thousands were injured. That's the official version, but there are many who have disputed that version and the reasons that the towers have collapsed. And we've had a few people on the Muckrakers discussing that. As always, my mission on the Muckrakers is to uncover the truth, and 9/11 certainly changed the course of history. By finding the truth, we can change it again. Well, to help me do that, I'm joined by, yet again, Martin J. For those of you who didn't see him before, he's the journalist who won the awards but managed to get fired by every media giant in the process, including CNN, who called him a good journalist but a pain in the backside, but that wasn't quite the word they used. He claims to have been everywhere, seen everything, and interviewed everybody from Harry Potter to the Italian Prime Minister. His words, not mine. He's also the editor of Maghrebi.org and Levantist.me, and more about them later, the go-to point and sites that we would urge you to have a look at. He loves dogs, lives in his own house he built himself on the edge of the Sahara, which survived the earthquake, and once published an anti-corruption magazine in Brussels, which lifted the lid on corrupt MEPs. I'm also delighted to be joined by Matt Campbell, who's the brother of Jeff Campbell, who was a British citizen who was tragically killed on the 11th of September 2001 while attending a Risk Waters conference on the 106th floor of the North Tower. Since November 2001, Matt has been actively researching 9/11 and campaigning for justice for his brother. Matt has contributed to a number of 9/11 documentaries, including Incontrovertible, The Last Secrets of 9/11, Surviving 9/11, and The Unspeakable. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Now, Matt, I want to start with you, and you've been a guest on TNT a number of times. Today is the day then you may well be filing this judicial review. And for those who don't know, this is a judicial review. It basically focuses on the procedure used to make decisions. It doesn't look at the correct version of the decision, but basically the lawfulness of decisions made by public bodies. Talk us through where you are with that. And I think you're saying you might file it by 4 o'clock today.
Yeah, so today of all days, we may actually be filing at the High Court. But essentially, through a mechanism through the Coroner's Act, we've been trying to get my brother's inquest reopened. He had an initial one back in 2013. It was very much rubber stamped, all over. I think they spoke about him for about 3 minutes, and it was just really dotting the I's, crossing the T's. And so we went through the process of trying to get my brother's inquest reopened. The Attorney General has twice now refused to allow that to happen. And so, we've got no choice but to do this challenging process called judicial review, where you're able to challenge someone in authority through the High Court. And so we have actually done the initial filing, this sort of summary of grounds and facts back in April. But I mean, it's such a large e-bundle of documents that we've got to put together. It's some 7,500 pages. And there's essential reading, and obviously there's the original application we put in 3 years ago, actually. So it's just taken time. So yeah, I mean, it's not been engineered. It just so happens that it looks like we're actually going to finally be able to file this at the High Court, hopefully by 4:00 today. And this is essentially challenging that the decision made by the Attorney General was both unlawful and irrational. And it's key because once it's lodged, they have 21 days to respond, and they're either going to capitulate, and I can go into why I'm quite optimistic that may happen, or of course they're going to try and fight us in court. So it's an important day for lots of reasons. Myself and my mum and my brother visited my brother's grave this morning. It's always a crappy time of year, but I'm glad that I'm doing something positive today.
No, you're absolutely right. And as I say, a judicial review basically assesses the lawfulness of decisions made by the public body, and it basically focuses on the procedure used, not the decision's correctness. So they might still reach the same decision. Just before we do a deep dive into that, it's obviously a very challenging time for you and your family. How are you coping at the moment?
I mean, to be honest, it does get easier with time. I mean, that's just one of those things. I do find this time of year very hard, partly, I guess, just obviously it is the anniversary. It was an unimportant date prior to my brother's death. His birthday was in December. And yet, obviously, over the years, you're reminded of it that although I don't watch a lot of mainstream media at all, it's just become saturated at this sort of time. And I never stopped wanting to talk about my brother. But it is hard to always be looking back, and you're trying to look forward, and hence what I'm doing right now is to help, I guess, move on. But for me, getting the truth is really important.
Yeah, and absolutely. They always say people die 3 times. One is the time when they die, but basically when they physically die. The other is when they get put in the ground, and the third time is when we stop talking about them. So it's so important to talk about your brother. Just give us a measure of the man.
I mean, he was very smart. He was definitely the best looking one out of the 3 brothers. He sailed through university. He had really good jobs. He had been living in New York for a couple of years, just gotten engaged. I last saw him about 3 weeks before he was killed. He had everything going for him. He was just 31. Very bright. He played badminton for England. He could challenge my little brother, who played chess for England, to a really good game. I mean, normally he'd have to get my brother drunk at about 4 a.m, but he's just one of those guys. Life came easy to him, Yeah.
I mean, and are you in touch with any of the other families who were affected?
I mean, sure. There's people in the States who have been supportive and have submitted their own letters of support with the original application. I'm in contact with about 20 of the victims represented by various people in this country, in England. And I'd say 2 of the victims represented are supportive of what I'm doing. But, for their own reasons, they don't want to either go public or, do what I'm doing to challenge this in the courts.
Let me bring in Martin here before I say we do the deep dive. What are your views on this, Martin?
Oh, it's such a weighty subject. It must be very, very hard for people this time of the year, like Matt, to even turn on a radio or a TV set. I just Googled it earlier on. 9/11 is not one of my subjects, but over the years I've had to look into it deeper and deeper because I see a historical context to 9/11 more and more the older I get as a journalist. We are looking now at the most horrific period in our history, in our lives, in Gaza right now. Nothing compares to this. I mean, you want to compare it to the Holocaust, some people do, but I didn't experience the Holocaust. I wasn't born. But in my lifetime, I couldn't imagine anything like Gaza happening now. And cynical journalists like me tend to put these things into historical context. I wonder if Gaza could have happened. I wonder if the Israelis had gone ahead with such an appalling campaign if such things like 9/11 didn't precede it. 9/11 for me was a new level, a new line, a new threshold in just how far a state can cheat its own people, how far it can go to shamefully use its own people for another darker, nefarious political agenda. I don't believe those towers came down by the jets. I just don't. I never did believe it. And you don't have to be an architectural expert to see that. I've watched a lot of the documentaries. I've watched all the architects and the structural engineers say the same thing, that only a controlled explosion can do that to those two towers. But what is really disturbing, what is upsetting, what makes me sad is the lack, of any sort of real questioning going on, in America. Of course, you have all alternative media. There are dozens of people who've made documentaries, but it all gets put into that category of sort of semi-professional, the conspiracy theory corner. It all gets thrown into that, whatever the quality of it, because no mainstream journalists, there aren't regular journalists in America who are prepared to ask the really difficult questions and turn over the rocks and present something which questions the narrative for America. It's funny how foreigners around the world don't accept what we are told by the official version of 9/11. Just simply is preposterous for most of us. For most Americans, I would say a good part of Americans, I would say 90% of Americans don't even go through the painful process of trying to even question it. And I think profoundly, if I can be profound on your show, Andrew, I think this has got a lot to do with the identity of Americans in relation to Europeans. I think broadly speaking, and I am trying to generalize it, I think broadly speaking, Americans are much, much more patriotic than Europeans. They seem to be less cynical about their own state. There is this deep-rooted idea from a lot of Americans that we left Europe in 1666. We turned our back on evil Europe, where elites treated people appallingly for their own political gains and financial gains, and we created America, which was basically based on principles and morals, and where the people that we elect or charge to control us don't do what the Europeans do to us. Now, I don't know how many people believe that now, but a lot of Americans still believe that. And when you talk about 9/11, a coping mechanism which we've never seen before, you have to go back to the two main wars that America had in its history before you start thinking about the kind of level of traumatism that people have been inflicted with. And I think 9/11 traumatized an entire nation, and a lot of people, I would say the vast majority of people shut down and went into a coping mechanism, which was to close their eyes and to say, we don't really understand it, but we can't believe our own state, our own people did that to us. It was hard enough for most people to accept that foreign individuals, foreign terrorists, or a foreign entity flew those planes into the towers. But to go to the next level and expect people to believe that actually it was an inside job, it's too much for most people. I had a dinner party here in Marrakesh a few months ago. I was sort of invited as a guest, as the star guest, if you like. It was a party made up of about 15 or 16 retired American journalists, all from the big names, from CNN, from New York Times, from the Post, ABC, the lot. They were all in their 60s. They were all on foreign desks. They were all covering international news. They were either journalists or producers. And when the subject of 9/11 came up, the atmosphere in the room became quite icy, and people actually basically turned on me because I suggested that the narrative was not true at all, and we were having the wool pulled over our eyes. And there was a second story there which was completely challenged the main one. And people got very upset with me, very angry with me, and everybody threw conspiracy theorists at me. But what I learned in that evening was that educated Americans, even those in the news business who were supposed to be cynical, who were supposed to be skeptical about everything that the state feeds them, even people at that level have dealt with 9/11 by basically shutting their eyes very, very close, tight, and really not wanting to question anything. And I think the evil people behind 9/11 knew that that was going to happen. They more or less judged it correctly. They knew that there was not going to be a process which would open this can and actually look at some of the facts. And so we leave it to the fringe of alternative media or amateur media, bloggers and wannabe journalists and people like that to put these stories together, some of them very professionally made, to ask all the difficult questions. And of course, the level of animosity and passion and hurt by an entire nation is so much, is so great, that you see it in the timelines, you see it in the chat windows, you see it in the comment section, that anybody who puts up a theory which questions what the government is telling us is basically destroyed, really destroyed. There's a lot of anger, hell of a lot of anger. So they have a coping mechanism to deal with it. The sad thing, I suppose, is that today on the anniversary, we see Trump and Harris going to the ceremonies and paying their respects. What we're not going to see is any in-depth reporting. What we're not going to see is any, after 23 years, we've now unearthed this kind of reports. We're not going to see that, and really sadly, we're most certainly not going to see any talk whatsoever today of having a real 9/11 commission, which actually deals with all these myths and deals with all these so-called conspiracy theories and actually asks the really, really tough questions and is completely apolitical, outside of the political mold. That's what we need to get to the truth of 9/11. I wonder if even in my own lifetime, we will get to the truth of 9/11. I'm skeptical, Andrew.
Well, I think, and it's right to be sceptical, but what's good about, so certainly here on the Muckrakers on this particularly important day, is that we do ask those questions. And as I say, we're coming with a completely open mind, and to dismiss things as conspiracy theories is offensive to people's memories. We need to get to the truth, and that's our only mission here. We're going to take a quick break. When we do come back, we're going to do a deeper dive, and we're going to look at some of that evidence that was referenced in those 7,500 pages. Don't touch that dial.
Tracking global corruption and threats that undermine our security. This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And if you're interested in news from the Middle East, do check out levantis.me, which breaks down all the main stories into plain English and presents you with just what you need to know each day. For news, comment and analysis, and a really fresh, non-partisan take on news from the Middle East, and of course, what's really going on in Gaza, try levantis.me, which you can also find on X as Levantis_ME. Now, I'm joined here on the Muckrakers by Martin J. and also Matt Campbell. And on this, the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, we're still in search of the truth. And just before the break, Matt was saying that today may be the day when he files this application for judicial review. And it's 7,500 pages of evidence and reasons for that. I don't have time to go through every single page, but I would like to look at some of them because it's important that we have a platform to discuss some of those. So Matt, talk me through the headlines and let's have a look at some of that evidence.
Yeah, so I mean, the actual original application, which was 2,500 pages, we put forward the case that first of all there was a complete insufficiency of inquiry, that there wasn't really any attempt to establish how my brother died, which they have a lawful obligation to do that through the mechanism of an inquest, and we also introduced a lot of new evidence that wasn't put in front of the coroner at that original inquest. Where you've got things like evidence of extreme temperatures, evidence of incendiaries being used in the dust. You've got the way that the Tower 1, the North Tower my brother was in, came down, constant acceleration for about the first 4 seconds. From a physics point of view, that's impossible for it still to be destroying what's underneath. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony. So there's a lot of first responders, including police officers, who are witness to explosions and flashes, etc. We also have expert testimony in the form of chemists, physicists, etc., and engineers who were putting forward and highlighting the evidence that shows that the towers didn't come down naturally. And And we also look at Building 7 as well, which is probably the easiest in terms of looking at the use of explosives for demolition and the fact that it fell at free fall acceleration for whatever it was, 2.25 seconds.
And just on Building 7, because it is important. This often comes up, and I've had a number of people, engineers on the Muckrakers, talking about exactly that. And then say, because just to be clear on this, Building 7, there were no planes that went into Building 7. Talk us through what happened with Building 7, because it is important. Then we come back to the other evidence.
No plane hit it. When the North Tower collapsed, it damaged the south side of a little bit of the south side of Building 7. So if anything, if it was going to collapse, you'd expect it to fall asymmetrically and not into its own footprint, because only one side had been damaged. There were some fires on a few floors, most of which had gone out by late afternoon. And it's just the extraordinary manner in which it fell. I mean, if you just eyeball it, it looks like a controlled demolition. But it wasn't until a high school physicist actually challenged NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, who were tasked with doing a report on how that tower came down. He pointed out, that basically anyone with a simple physics tool could show you that actually the tower fell at free fall acceleration for those 2.25 seconds. And that basically means that not a single column of that tower gave any resistance whatsoever. I mean, that just the only way
it actually imploded. It actually imploded in the center of the first for like a quarter second. If you watch the film very carefully, and a lot of experts say that has to be a controlled demolition for the central columns to be exploded first. If you look at the aerial at the top of it, there's something like about half a second where the aerial actually comes in to the building before the building falls down.
You're referring to the North Tower. I mean, yes, so the area was on there, but I mean, for me, the physics is very strong for Building 7. And I said the constant acceleration for the North Tower is also something that's impossible. So our judicial review application that we put in obviously still references the original application, but we have a lot of case law where we can show that actually the threshold for a family getting a new inquest to be granted is so incredibly low. We're well over that bar, no pun intended, in terms of what we've put forward in front of the Attorney General. If this wasn't 9/11, if it wasn't so politically, loaded as obviously an event that affected the world, it would have been really straightforward to have had a new inquest granted. The reasons they've given in both their refusals, but the important one is the one they gave in January this year, the refusal, are unlawful. They're not based on any process or applying legal tests they're supposed to apply to our application. They haven't really engaged with any of our evidence, not that we can tell in their very terse sort of letter that they wrote back to us. And it's kind of infuriating because they then cite things that have no bearing on how my brother died. They start talking about an FBI report that what was put in front of the coroner, for example, was a single page summarizing the trial of Zacharias Masui. Has nothing to do with my brother's death. And anyway, they do things like that. They refer to the 9/11 Commission report, which doesn't address how the towers came down. They refer to NIST in their latest refusal, which that wasn't put in front of the coroner, and B, it doesn't address the evidence we put forward. So it's kind of it's almost amateurish how they've responded. I think they just think we're going to go away because what I've not, it's a bit of a detail, but they refused twice. The first time they refused was June last year, and again we started to threaten. We went down this process of judicial review. They actually capitulated when we sent them a warning letter, basically saying these are the grounds we're going to attack you on. They, which you do as a kind of courtesy, a legal courtesy. They withdrew their decision because they knew they would absolutely lose if it went to the High Court. So this second decision, honestly, they've just added a bit more nonsense to their response. So for me, it's exactly the same situation. They will lose if we get our case considered fairly in court. So I'm really hopeful that we've just had a change of government. Not that you'd think these things make much difference, but there is a new Attorney General. There's a new Solicitor General. We have a new government in place. This is the moment for them to go, actually we can go and blame this poor decision on the previous administration. So I'm hopeful that they see sense and effectively blame the previous Attorney General.
It is interesting just picking up on various things throughout history where we still want to do the deeper dive, where questions are still left unanswered. You had a similar situation with Trump, who pledged that he will open the investigation into the assassination of JFK. So these things don't necessarily get swept under the carpet. As you say, new administrations or potential new administrations do raise it. For the sake of clarity, though, Matt, I want to just make it clear to everybody what a judicial review basically is, because it assesses the lawfulness of the decisions. There's two separate things. One is, was the decision lawfully made? And the other thing is then looking at the evidence of that decision. So there are two separate things, aren't there? And one is the 7,500 pages that you've got. I presume the bulk of the evidence is about the decision that was made rather than the lawfulness of how that decision was made. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, there are two levels. So there's one, just purely have they applied the correct legal test?
Yes.
I mean, I can just read very briefly the main points the grounds that we're challenging on. So first of all, failure to apply the correct legal test, unreasonable rejection of the insufficiency of inquiry ground on the original application. I mean, they really did no investigation at all. Failure to give adequate reasoning for the wholesale rejection of the new evidence. Unreasonable assertion of a clear consensus view regarding the cause of the North Tower's collapse, because there really isn't a clear consensus view. That's even from NIST itself and leading engineers, etc., who have published their own theories as to how they think the towers collapsed. And unreasonable categorization of the family's hypothesis as being fanciful. I mean, it's basically the way that they've responded doesn't address our application. So it's mainly on the law, I guess, because it is the lawfulness of that decision that this body has made. You know, it's the Attorney General. But because they also, to a certain extent, attacked our evidence, we are also countering that in our application. So obviously we refer to the.
I think that's absolutely right, Matt, and I think that's why it's so important that people understand this. I mean, that the judicial review basically said, did they reach their decision in a lawful way? That's the only issue they look at. The evidence basically means that they go back and have to look at all the evidence again when they basically review the decision in the first place. But to dismiss your hypothesis, to use the words that you just mentioned, the family's hypothesis was fanciful. That's offensive at the very least, isn't it?
It's offensive, and some of the context around the way that they kind of made that assertion that it's fanciful is they said things like, you know, they couldn't comprehend the benefit of secondary devices because, you know, effectively looking at, say, the planes hitting the towers, and then why would you need that extra step of destroying the towers? History's rife with secondary devices with acts of terrorism. On the day, both pre-collapse and after the first tower came down, there are so many statements from first responders. They're all concerned about secondary devices, secondary bombs going off. It's completely normal. So for us to put forward this idea that actually the towers were brought down, it's not fanciful at all. History shows us that's the case. And even if I cite something as recent as the Manchester arena bombing, the inquiry there, I mean, I went through and did a search on all the times that the first responders were concerned about secondary devices. There's about 31 times it comes up in the inquiry report. It's a normal thing, you know, that you should be concerned about. And so, yeah, the way that they dismissed everything to me is, it's disrespectful, it's unlawful, it's irrational, and I don't think they're properly engaged with the evidence, which they are supposed to do.
Yeah,
they have
and the reality, a lot of the people watching, Matt, are not experts in structures and so on and so forth. They're not engineers, which is why we need to talk to the experts. And we're always trying to get evidence, if you like. People will be watching this and saying, well, okay, I was there this day. I might have an extra bit of information. For example, you talk about evidence of backing up the interview with O'Neill's bodyguard and that sort of side, and getting extra people who might come forward to assist with that. Just in a nutshell, then I want to bring Martin in. In a nutshell, what is the family's hypothesis?
That essentially the North Tower, which my brother was in, was brought down through the use of incendiaries and explosives. And that's the cause of the tower's collapse and ultimately the cause of my brother's death, not through the planes hitting the towers, that they causing fires and then in turn causing the building's collapse. I mean, that's specifically written into the coroner's verdict, the summary form that we had in 2013. And we're challenging that because of the new evidence and because they did no inquiry.
Okay. Martin.
Yeah, and the NIST inquiry was really a parody of an inquiry. The most extraordinary thing about 9/11 is if you look at it from a skeptical view, perhaps as a foreigner, and you just look with just no rose-tinted vision at all, but just look at the bare facts in front of you, you cannot help not noticing the absolute extent of the cover-up. The cover-up is just breathtaking. Matt talks about the use of additional explosives. How can we talk about 9/11 and not acknowledge that explosives were used in the buildings? You've got eyewitness accounts, you've got firemen, you've got people even shouting. I've heard the video clips. People have been shouting and talking about explosions. People have actually warned that there are imminent explosions. That's also quite curious. You've got video of the minor puffs of gases coming out of the buildings at lower than the concertina effect of the buildings falling. But the cover-up thing is for me the real core, the real essence of the 9/11 story, and it's just amazing that 23 years later we are not hearing the voices, the voices in America asking these really difficult questions. When 9/11 came down, one of the most extraordinary things that happened almost immediately, really within minutes, literally within minutes. I think the same day, Matt might correct me, it might have been the same day or the second day, was that the iron girders that made up all of the support of the building were taken out of the dust, put onto lorries, and as quickly as possible, within a couple of days, put onto boats and sent to China. And why do you do that? Why does a state do that when you have the responsibility, as Matt says, to investigate on behalf of those dead citizens? Why would a government body actually take the responsibility of removing key evidence? You have to look at that in a suspicious light. You have to say something is very, very, very wrong here. We really are having a wool pulled over our eyes when the chief components of the main damning evidence, which are the steel girders. You need the steel girders. You have to examine the steel girders. And, the experts, the engineers and the architects, they've made their documentaries. They talk a lot about thermite. Thermite is, I'm not an expert on this at all. I have to read it up. Thermite is an essential chemical that is used in controlled demolitions. And the reason why it's used is because when it blows, when it ignites, it melts girders at about 1,300 degrees centigrade. And that is the key thing about 9/11, is that those steel girders, those columns, had to be exploded in a very, very well organized, very synchronized fashion for what the experts, for what the engineers and the architects say is a zero resistance fall. Now, the reason why you have those towers that come down so perfectly, so beautifully, if I can use that word, almost poetically, without veering over 3 or 4% on either side, or 10% or 20%, which typically, if you've seen hundreds of thousands of demolitions of towers, they always veer over at a certain point when you have explosives at the bottom. But the reason why 9/11 comes down so elegantly in a perfect, straight, vertical line, according to the engineers, is only because of controlled demolition. And controlled demolition where you have explosives on every single column, on every single level, so that there is what they call zero resistance. So those platforms, you don't need this theory of the concertina effect, of the pancaking, of the more floors that fall onto one another, the greater the weight, the greater the power. That theory is thrown out of the window because you don't even need the greater weight to bring down a building if you have zero resistance. Now, the engineers talk about zero resistance. They obsess a lot about thermite. They obsess about when the inspectors went in and NIST did their report, that some people came across a lot of molten iron. Now, molten iron can only come about through being melted by the thermite, and the thermite was present everywhere. And so this is really what they were trying to cover up: is how did the building come down? Did it come down because two planes flew into the top of it? No, But the interesting thing for me also is that I wonder if this process that Matt's going through can kickstart something in America. And in a country that is supposedly so wealthy and with so much money at stake, with the kind of compensation claims that could become available. We talk about history. There's no history of this, no history of that. There's no history of steel frame buildings burnt down. Steel frame buildings don't burn down. There's history of plenty of them catching fire all over the world, but they don't burn down. They need to. I mean, a cool burning fire, and it was a cool burning fire because you saw the black smoke. It was starved of oxygen. I don't know what that was. 500, 600 degrees centigrade, nowhere near the level that you need of 1300 degrees to melt those steel girders, to actually make them buckle and finally break. So a massive, massive cover-up we're dealing with here, with the thermite, with the molten iron. The number of people who talked about explosions, who heard explosions at several stages, that all confirms, along with how the buildings fell, that all confirms. We can't call it a theory anymore, Andrew. It's not a theory anymore that these buildings were destroyed by controlled demolition. When you have that number of experts from all over the world, not just American experts, from Netherlands, from Germany, from Japan, when they're all saying this is a controlled demolition, Yeah. But I wonder whether we might see some really freaky examples of people trying to disprove or prove these myths. I mean, how is it that in 23 years' time we haven't flown a building, a 707 jetliner into a steel frame building? I mean, airlines get rid of their planes every single day. They send them to the desert in Texas and Arizona. Why don't we experiment? Why don't we fly one into a similar? Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to even throw a couple of 100 gallons of avgas onto an abandoned steel frame building in Detroit and actually watch to see what happens. So we've got a long, long, long way to go before even the process of accountability, before journalists even start to really get out of their comfort zone and ask those awkward questions.
Yeah, and we're going to continue asking those awkward questions, continuing holding people's feet to the fire. As I said, I had Ted Walter and David Chandler, who I'm sure you know very well, Matt as well, on this show. They are experts in engineering, and they said it is just not possible for these buildings to collapse in the way, and they particularly cite Building 7, and I would urge people to go and have a look at that evidence. And as I say, that's our mission here, is our search for the truth. We're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll do a deeper dive and also find out how we can follow up more with both Martin and also Matt. Don't touch that dial.
Tracking global corruption and threats that undermine our security. This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And on this important 9/11 anniversary, I'm delighted to be joined by Martin Jay and also Matt Campbell, who's the brother of Jeff Campbell, who died on that day. And we've been looking at the truth and potential implications, and we've been going through some of the evidence, because that's all we can do, is sort of question things. We're not experts, but what we can do is listen to those experts. Matt says he's about to file a judicial review, quite appropriate, before 4 o'clock today, and you want to talk about the international implications. Matt?
Yeah, so we told the official narrative. You said at the start of the show, the 19 hijackers, directed by bin Laden, hijacked the four planes. I mean, we now know, since 23 years down the line, that a cover-up pretty much started day one. Certainly in terms of the involvement of Saudi Arabia. We've got the 2002 joint inquiry that produced the infamous 28 pages, which essentially looked at material support given by Saudi Arabia, supported by Saudi intelligence, and that continues to be covered up. My dad is part of the Motley Rice Saudi Arabian lawsuit, and some people might say limited hangout. I mean, for me, it's shining more light on the whole story of 9/11, and it does involve, I think, several states. It's obviously it's a complex operation. I mean, talking about Saudi Arabia's involvement, I mean, the CIA actively were protecting two of the hijackers from, I think, January 2000. And they're all woven into the illegal operation that the CIA were running with Saudi Arabia. All this has come about through the pre-trial phases of the Saudi lawsuits, but also through the trials. It's still in pre-trial at Guantanamo Bay, where, oddly enough, I've been there, went there in 2016. All these legal cases, to me, are really important, because otherwise you've just got endless theories going around and people talk about stuff. The legal system has its flaws, but it is a tried and tested way of at least trying to get to some truth. And maybe we'll get that with several new commissions set up down the line. But right now I'm interested in the legal side. So, the trials at Guantanamo Bay, the Saudi lawsuits, and obviously in my own way, what I'm trying to do in the UK, I think are very important, because it is trying to shine a light and expose more truth about what happened that day. And I see it, with all its flaws, as the best mechanism to do that. But you need to look no further than some sort of inside job or cover up if you just look at the situation with the Saudis and the CIA. It's that simple for me.
I want to pick on one of the things that you mentioned, because you tweeted about this very recently, and this plea deal that was done with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, basically, who's in Guantanamo Bay, and it's basically a plea deal that if he pled guilty to the murder of those victims, then he might avoid the death penalty. And there's an argument about whether that plea deal was accepted. You say that plea deal will effectively prejudice further investigation. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, as soon as you do a plea deal, and so, I don't want to see actually these guys killed. For me, I know it's a death penalty case. It's I want the trial to expose the truth of what's happened, their role in the attacks. As soon as you do a plea deal, just like we saw with the Zacharias Massoudi trial, there's no cross-examination. The standards of evidence that can be put up as prosecution exhibits, for example, just fall by the wayside. So one of the things that's always frustrated me over the years is to get hold of the authenticated flight manifests, which I know exist. But as soon as Zacharias Massoudi pleaded guilty, they just put up a graphic of where people sat, etc. Now, I know that the authenticated flight manifests have been submitted as part of the Guantanamo trials. These are just things that I think should already be on public record. But once you've got a plea deal, that kind of bar of interrogation and the evidence that you need to produce just becomes really low. And I don't want to see that. And so I was furious when I heard the plea deal was announced, even though it gave me an opportunity to ask questions of the three men who did the plea deal. So in some respects, I was looking forward to doing that, but that's now been cancelled, because within 2 days, the Defence Secretary overturned the decision that had been made at the plea deal. So, I know they're going to appeal, but I really hope it doesn't go back to a plea deal, because that's just another way of shutting down a proper investigation or exposure of the truth. And some interesting things have already come out in pre-trial, corroborating what I said about the CIA's involvement. They actually refused the defence team access to any crime scene materials, including Building 7 and the Twin Towers. There's stuff that process is exposing the level of the cover-up that the US authorities still seem to be doing.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we do talk about that. I've spoken about this on the Muckrakers beforehand, about that particular plea deal, and I'm never a fan of plea deals, and certainly always urge anybody, never accept a plea deal, even if it looks like the easy way out if you're not guilty. But if you look at the conditions in Guantanamo Bay, where effectively torture is happening all the time, people would admit to anything. And you then get that admission, and then effectively to have it overturned, I think is quite abhorrent. But as you say, a different angle on it is you don't want to bury the obvious line of in question. Martin.
Yeah, the international politics of 9/11 are fascinating. We probably haven't got long enough in the next 10 minutes to discuss them. But to take a helicopter view of them, and perhaps most Americans don't do this, look at the international politics and the aspirations of the George W. Bush administration. Look who was advising him, Dick Cheney, who also advised his dad. Look at what his dad was trying to do in his first term, which was to get into a number of Middle Eastern countries and to basically steal a lot of oil. And the top two countries that George Bush Sr. wanted to get into and couldn't were Afghanistan and Iraq. And so, when you talk about cover up or you talk about inside job, I mean, I think at best we can assume that it's a cover up, and that George W. Bush and his intelligence cronies close to him were informed that this was going to happen, and they paused for a moment and thought, how can we benefit from this? And obviously, with Dick Cheney standing over the president's shoulder, Cheney must have said to him, boy, you wanted to get into Afghanistan and Iraq, or your dad has for years now. Now's your chance. What are you waiting for? Because look at the events which happened within days after 9/11. He was talking about bombing Afghanistan and Iraq and getting into those countries. It took a bit of a while to organize things, but they went into those countries. They searched for cheap oil and cheap energy deals. The energy deal that was on offer in Afghanistan had been there since 1988, and leading up to when George Bush Sr. got into power. A Californian energy company wanted to invest in a $5 trillion gas pipeline right across the country. And when they always had problems dealing with the Taliban. Taliban wanted $100 million security every year, and nobody wanted to pay that. And, so an idea evolved from that is, wouldn't it be cheaper, more efficient, and more beneficial for everyone around if we just invaded Iraq and kicked the ass of the Afghanistan, and kicked the ass of the Taliban and went ahead with our deal? It didn't happen in the end. Same with Iraq. The administration was always looking for cheap, if not free, oil, and that was the same incentive to send troops there. The conspiracy theorists will point to Israel. They will say Israel, for a very, very long time, has been very worried that there is nowhere near enough animosity around the world, in the Western world, towards Muslims, and they wanted to stir up much, much more hatred against Muslims, and that would be an excellent way of doing it. It remains a conspiracy theory. It's one that I'm prepared to kick around because I can see the logic behind it. I can see how easily those Saudis could be easily duped into talking to who they believe are people working for bin Laden in chat rooms, but in fact talking to Mossad agents. But the whole thing stinks from beginning to end. No matter how much involvement the George Bush administration and his advisors were involved in it, it seems to me that the cover-up went so far. I mean, even to the point where the day that 9/11 happened, someone very senior in the military had organized a drill of the whole of the east of America, of a scenario where terrorists were in the sky. And so all the F-16s that were normally on alert were up in the air, and you can hear the radio communication constantly. People are saying over the radio, "Is this a drill? Is this a drill?" When they're being told about 9/11 and the Pentagon and all that. And, the Pentagon, we can do a whole show about what hit the Pentagon. 100 things could have possibly hit the Pentagon, but there's hardly anybody in the world who's prepared to say it's a commercial airliner, because the facts just aren't there. Nothing backs that up at all. So the international politics, I think, is really a subject which we don't look at enough. But if we look at the historical context, if Israel really was the mastermind of it, you can see how it gained a certain traction. How look at all the terrorism was experienced in the UK in the last few years has emerged from the wars that we created in Iraq. Al Qaeda and ISIS grew from the ashes of what we did in those countries, and then the knock-on effect of that is you have fanatics in Europe who do the killing and the murdering they do. All this can be traced back to a period leading up to 9/11, where there wasn't, I'm almost afraid to use the words, there wasn't enough hatred of Muslims around the world. So, I think the spotlight is on Israel. It is on the George Bush, W. Bush administration. I think there is culpability there, which explains so much of why the cover-up has to be so deep and so profound and so efficient. I mean, they went to extraordinary lengths, really extraordinary lengths, to make sure a proper investigation couldn't be done. But I think we need that investigation today, because the military...
You're absolutely right. And I think we will absolutely do what we can to help ensure there is that investigation. I want to give Matt the final word. Before I do that, though, Martin, just remind people how they can find and follow your work.
Oh, that's very kind of you. They can follow me by Googling my name and Patreon. People can follow all of my articles on Patreon, or they can follow me on Twitter on my handle, which is Martin RJAY.
Excellent. And do go to the relevant sites as well, as we mentioned at the top of the show, and also throughout. Matt, I do want to give the final word to you. What should people do to continue to help support you in your quest?
The path is still potentially quite a long one. The easiest thing is always to help finance this. Everything's been crowdfunded. It's been amazing, the support I've had worldwide to do what I'm doing. A lot's going to happen in the next month, depending on what decision and what path the Attorney General decides to take. You can follow me on X on Matt Campbell 911. But for sort of probably a bit more meat to what's going on, the best way of following is to go to ic911.org. That's the International Centre for 9/11 Justice. Ted Walter, you mentioned earlier, that heads up that. He's been really helpful, has been way back in 2018 when he worked for Architects and Engineers. But he's been consistent throughout the whole process of trying to get my brother's inquest reopened. So that's a good way of following what we're doing. And like I said, a lot's going to happen this month is absolutely critical. And it really depends where we go and which path we take as to what help and support I need. I think the most important thing is to actually just publicise what I'm doing. It still astonishes me to this day that when my brother had the initial inquest, it was with 9 other people, not one mention anywhere in any of the mainstream press, all local. It was, I think they were fearful because obviously I think the 9/11 truth movement, whatever that is, it kind of got fairly large in 2006 to 2008. And I think they were probably worried about, publicising that this was going on. But, only 2 victims were represented by families. So long had passed, even those who had lost someone really, didn't want to turn up to the inquest.
Yeah. It is difficult. Well, we will get you back if you're happy to come back anytime and continue keeping us updated on your quest as we remember your brother Jeff Campbell on this anniversary. Martin, as always, thank you very much for joining us. Matt, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next time. I'll be back with you tomorrow with Elon Musk's father, Errol, will be making a return appearance. Do join me then. Thanks a lot.
If you missed this hour, simply go to episodes at tntradio.live